Hello everybody, I am Jarrett Ross, the GeneaVlogger, and on today's vlog, we will be continuing researching the family tree of Sam Aronow. So now we're going to go to the Miglin topic, and we're going to see what are they talking about. And the first entry right off the bat is amazing. And I went to this website to get the further scoop, and this is going to be a big step for us. So here we have the website for what we saw on the JRoots community. So I've already gone through this. I've done what I need to for the research and building, but now I'm going to explain it to you all. So going to the actual page here, it's the same thing that's posted here. All this long, big amount of stuff. But with this one, there's pictures. And so it gives a history of the town of Miglin, and this gives us a view into what we want, because part of the thing that we need to know is the context of how large of a town was it. We can, at this point, assume it's somewhat smaller than most towns or communities, just because when we looked at the town finder, there really wasn't a lot. Although that can sometimes be because there are very few descendants left of that town. But if it's not a very large town and we don't find that many Aronovs in the town, maybe that's just one family that adopted that name, and anybody that we can kind of find with the name in the area, we can make the assumption are all part of the same family. But once again, we have to keep in our minds that we're going to be making not necessarily assumptions, but more hypotheses. So we're going to want to be actively disproving or proving these hypotheses. So going through, we got a good idea of the town. It was a pretty big town, but not huge. And I will need to do a bit more research in terms of getting someone to look through the actual Russian, because the translation, some of it doesn't seem to match quite what it's saying. So we get a lot of surnames. It talks about the differences in surnames and why you might have some where it ends with more of a ski instead of an ov. Then we get a picture of the area. So from the cemetery, this is the view. And then we get some pictures of gravestones from the cemetery, and interesting sort of round stones. But then the most important thing is it actually gives the information from the 1850 census. Now it says there were 9 families of Jews living in the city. So that's in 1850. Merchants of the Third Guild, in which there were 99 souls and 96 shower rooms. I think by shower rooms they mean houses, but I'm not quite sure. Then we get the tale, which the tale, that's the translation of a revision list. So it says was counted 3 times at a secular gathering in order to check for omissions. It gives more information about that. And then it says the main part of the Jewish population was made up of bourgeoisie. And 332 courtyards, there lived 1,236 souls of the M, not quite sure what that's supposed to be, 1,267 showers. So it's also not quite adding up, because it's saying there was only 9 families living in the city, but then the main part of the Jewish population had 1,236 souls. So were there only 99? Were there 1,236? Or is there something going on with this translation? So is there any sort of thing going on where it's not really meaning like, you know, the entire city, but a specific part of the city, and so it's splitting it up? So we could be looking at a pretty big population, but I think the big thing that we're probably going to go with is this sentence right here. Thus, by 1851, there were only 1,302 Jewish men and 1,315 women. In 1859, the total population of Miglin was 8,668. Jews accounted for at least 27% of the urban population and more than half of all burghers. So this is a pretty big area. We're looking at about 2,600 Jewish people living in Miglin in 1851. So there is a very high possibility that multiple families in this area took the name Aronov, which is a patronymic just meaning son of Aaron. But with this, we got something very, very interesting, and it requires us to have a little bit of that leniency when it comes to names. So remember, the original Russian, that's a transcription of an article that was written down here by, I'm just going to translate it to say the name, Anatoly Fedorovich Sidorov, which I've tried to look him up, and if it is the same person, he died in like 1999. So this is from a while back, transcribed, then translated. So there's a lot of possibilities between that of things that could happen to slightly change it. But in this, we get them describing some of these families. And they say here, another such large family belonged to the merchant Yanksala Avramov Aronos. Now, when I looked through the surnames of the town, there was no Aronos. The closest thing was Aronov. So the assumption that I'm taking at this point is that this person is probably an Aronov and not an Aronos. And this gives us a whole lot of information. So highlighting everything that it gives us on this family, it takes all of that. So all of this talks about the Aronov family, and we get a little confirmation that it is Aronov down here when it talks about Shlomo Avramov Aronov. So we know this is one Aronov family that is living in Miglin in 1850. This is from the 1850 census. So what am I going to do? I'm going to build a family tree. But I've already done that. And what now we're going to be looking at is that family tree that I've built and discussing what are these hypotheses we can make in terms of connecting Sam's family tree to this family tree. So here we have the family tree that I've built. I've put it on Genie. And what we're going to be looking for now is we're going to be looking for places where we think that Sam's family could fit into this family. Before we start doing that, I want to reiterate, one, what we're doing is we're creating a hypothesis that's going to require more research to confirm. But this is a very useful tool when doing genealogy. You don't want to assume that it's completely correct, but at the same time, you don't want to assume that there is no connection just because you can't confirm or connect your part of the tree to this tree. And then we will need to make decisions. Do we want to connect what we have to it yet, or do we want to hold off? So at this point, the only thing we can really use to try to correlate to this tree is Joseph's father, Yaakov Yehuda. So we're going to be looking for someone with that name that would fit into this tree at the right age. And when going through this, I had two possibilities. The first possibility was that Yankel's brother, and we're going to go all the way over here, Eudalia, or he's listed Eudalia and Eudaria. I'm going to jump back and just highlight that over here we go. So we have Eudaria in one spot, and then it lists him as Eudalia. So we don't quite know the name for sure. And this is something I looked into on the Jewish genealogy portal as well. And what I got was that there are a few possibilities. One is that the name could be Gedalia, which I think actually makes a lot of sense. But it was also mentioned that it could be Yedel or Edel, which is a nickname for Yehuda. So we have two possibilities. So this Eudalia could be the father of Joseph. Now, Joseph was born 1859, and this revision list is 1850. So it's 9 years before Joseph is born. We know he's not going to be in there. And we know that if he's born in 1859, his father could be as young as, 16 technically. So the father could be born as late as the 1840s. Or he could be a lot older. He could have been in his 40s or 50s once Joseph was born. So it's very possible that 1808 is the birth date. But I felt that the Gedalia name kind of made a bit more sense than it being a nickname for Yehuda. But the other possibility is a Yankel, son of Zalman. So going over, we got a brother to our main, I want to say protagonist. Basically, it's seeming the head of the household in Miglin, this Yankel Avramov Aronov, who's born 1803. But he has a brother, Zalman, born 1814. We have his wife's name, Delina Aronov. Now, it says Mendeleeva. I put that as a maiden name, but more than likely it's just a patronymic, meaning that her father is Mendel. And we get Zalman had 4 sons, but we only got birth dates on one of them, Avram. For the other 3, Mendel, Yankel, and Wilka, it just said that they were 3 sons who were minors. So in 1850, they were considered minors. And this leads to a question of what did they consider a minor? I couldn't find any concrete description of what that would be. I don't know if that was actually how they were described in the revision list, or that was just whoever wrote this was just kind of being lazy and like, they were minors, whatever. But if we're looking at Joseph's father being as young as 16 when he was born, that means 16 in 1859, he would have been born about 1843. So anything that's possible before 1843 would make sense. And well, if they consider minors anyone who was 18 years or younger, then in 1850, that means that he could have been born in 1832, or he could be much, much younger, but it fits into that approximate age. And honestly, he could have been born in 1836. He would have then been 14 when the revision list was taken, considered a minor. And then in 1859, he would have been the right age. He would have been in his 20s, I think 23. So I think that this is our most likely connection. I think that Yankel Aronov is the father of Joseph Aronov, who is the second great-grandfather of Sam Aronow. So if this is correct, that means that we have Sam's line traced back to the 18th century, because we know that we have the father of Yankel and Zalman and all the other siblings, whose name's Avram, who I estimate his death date was around 1827 based on the naming traditions of Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenazi Jews don't really name their children after someone who's living. And for Yankel, he had a son named Avram in 1828. And to me, that probably says that he was named after his grandfather after his grandfather died. And 2 years before Avram, it was a Zalman, also a son. So my guess is that Avram probably died about 1827, which matches up with all the children, because the youngest child listed is this Shlomo Aronov, who was born in 1827. So that would make sense with the last child being born the same year that the father died. And he would have been quite old, because Shlomo being born in 1827 and Yankel being the oldest, born in 1803, that's a 24-year gap between siblings. But then we do have the mother. The mother was living with Yankel at that time, and we have her birth date of 1787. And it also says that her father was Yankel, which makes sense because that's probably who Yankel was named after, which also tells us that it's very likely that his maternal grandfather had died before 1803, before he was born. But now that I've said all of that, we need to remember this is a hypothesis. We haven't proven it, but this is very, very strong. So where do we go from here? Well, there's a few things. Number one, we keep looking for more records for Miglin. We go more through JRoots, which I've gone through a lot of stuff on JRoots, and there are some interesting things, but there's nothing, as far as I can tell, that is really going to be of use. The other thing, getting researchers in the area to help out, which I've actually reached out to a few of my friends who research in Ukraine. But remember, this isn't an area that's in Russia now, so it's not going to be quite the same. But maybe some of these friends of mine might be able to help. But one of the biggest things that I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, especially with my specialty, DNA. Now, I don't believe Sam's done a DNA test. I mentioned it. I said if you have, we can, use it. I don't think he has, though. I can't remember what he said. But if he did a DNA test, one thing we can do is we can try to start tracing these family trees down. So if we remember, we have all of those revision lists that we found of people that had a connection to Miglin with the name Aronov. Didn't seem like a whole lot, and based on what we see with Miglin being maybe a large community, not super large. So then we have a chance of tracing some of these lines forward, finding living relatives, and then seeing if they've tested, or even seeing if they're willing to test. And especially if we can do Y-DNA testing and finding these different connections, we might be able to prove without a doubt that these are the same family members. But some things that we do want to look for, because I mentioned I want to try to disprove a lot of these hypotheses as well. So what do we want to look for? Can we prove if there was a second Aronov family that was not related to this one living in Miglin or even just Starodub, where they took the Aronov name, but they are not related? As well, can we find more documentation on Sam's family in America that might help point us in a different direction or say that maybe this isn't quite the family we're looking at? So we'll want to keep researching on the town itself as well, learn more specifics on the history of the town, the makeup of the Jewish families that lived there, and maybe where did they come from before Miglin? Because there are a lot of families that traveled much more than people would expect in the 1800s. And it's very possible that, the family was in Miglin in the 1850s, but in the 1830s, maybe they were somewhere completely different. And we have a very strong hypothesis set up here because from what I've seen so far, in comparison to a lot of the research I've done in larger towns and areas, it seems that this is small enough of a town that more than likely all of the Aronovs are all related to each other. But if that's correct as well, that means that we have hit a point in the family tree where we're likely looking at the family members that took the family name of Aronov, because most Jews adopted their surnames in the early 1800s. At least most Jews in Eastern Europe. A lot of Sephardi families had surnames for many, many generations, tracing back to well before 1492. There were a lot of different families in other areas of the world, such as Austria, that also had surnames tracing back very far. But for the most part, Jews in Eastern Europe used mostly just patronymics. So you would just be your first name, son of your father, or daughter of your father. Now, this episode concludes our portion of looking into the Aronow side of Sam's family, and on the next episodes, we'll begin looking at a different side of his family tree. Well, thank you so much for checking out this video. I do hope that you enjoyed. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. That really does help me out. You can also click right about here if you'd like to subscribe. It is completely free to do so. And if you'd like to get access to content early, or even more, get access to exclusive content, be sure to become a patron of mine on Patreon. And not only will you get all of that fun access, but you'll also be helping support my channel. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram